So does the Bible teach a rapture? Well, of course, that depends on what is meant by the term rapture. And that's really going to become the point of this little video. So recently, someone was asking me about eschatology. And they listed several issues relating to eschatology, that is, end time matters. Okay, and one of them was the rapture. Now, the person said they certainly don't believe in the rapture. And I said, well, you are correct. The rapture is not biblical. But see, now I'm assuming that they mean the dispensational type of rapture, which is popular today. And I think they did mean that. But see, that's not what necessarily what a person asking may refer to, at least all the things about the rapture. So here's my point. We have to be careful in defining our terms when we're talking to people, and when we affirm the Bible teaches something or deny that it teaches something, it's important to realize what a person understands by the terminology, because they might not realize and they might be confused when you say the Bible doesn't teach it or the Bible does because of their understanding of what that term is. So, for example, people may simply be asking about a particular concept that I do believe is biblical. Before the 1800s, the idea of the rapture, when people use it, referred to something that I do believe the Bible teaches, but has been really redefined by dispensational teaching. So one phrase always to keep in mind when you're having a theological discussion or a discussion about the Bible is the phrase, same vocabulary, different dictionary. Because it is very true that a lot of times we talk about things and we're using the same terminology and words, but we're not meaning the same thing by them. And we don't realize that, and we don't realize or can't figure out why the conversation doesn't get any further. It's because of that. So I was listening on the radio today to two people talk about the rapture, and it became very clear this same concept that I just told you about, that I usually do keep in mind when I'm talking to Calvinists, is that a person may be simply asking about a concept that I do believe is biblical, even though a lot of times I do tell people I don't believe in the rapture, because I'm referring to the dispensational type rapture. Now, dispensationalism, which I'm not here to explain a lot about it, but this theological package was invented by John Nelson Darby in the 1800s. Okay, premillennialism, even though I don't believe that either, but that did exist as a belief prior to John Nelson Darby. And so there are certain elements of dispensationalism that certainly were around before the 1800s, but dispensationalism as a teaching, really the basics, was invented by John Nelson Darby. Before the 1800s, just wasn't really a belief. But so here's the thing. Now, the rapture in that theology, which is the theology of the Left Behind movies and whatnot, is that Jesus comes secretly at some point in our future and raptures all believers from the world, and they're gone. And the church kind of continues, or not the church, but the world, that is, all unbelievers now left in the world, continue on. And sometimes a lot of dramatic things happen. And then at some point in the future, Jesus comes again visibly and actually judges the living and dead. But the rapture is his first invisible coming. So his coming is in two stages. He takes all believers. But now, see, here's the thing. This is what gives rise to the bumper sticker, In case of rapture, this car will be unmanned, that kind of thing. And in the movies, you see, people's clothes are just kind of left where they were when they got raptured, and what in the world's going on? That rapture and that idea of two-staged coming of Christ, that certainly is not biblical. Now, when I was growing up, well, I should say when I first became a Christian and for many years, the only rapture I knew of was that rapture. And so I would always say the Bible doesn't teach any rapture. And today, a lot of people that I associate with that are not dispensationalists will say the Bible doesn't teach a rapture. Well, but that can be very confusing because in a very simple way, there is something that the Bible teaches that you could call a rapture. Now, So let's talk about this for a second. Now, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul talks about, in verse 13, the resurrection. And so here's what he goes on to say. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, which is a way of speaking of the dead, so that you will not grieve as do the rest who have no hope. So evidently, Paul is writing to deal with some issue here, and it's about grieving as do the rest. In other words, you should not grieve as certain others do who have no hope. And so what is he talking about? Why would there be any who are grieving as if they didn't have a hope when they really do? Well, he says, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God, or in the same way, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Jesus, or those who have died in Christ, died believers, in other words. So what he's saying is, well, if we believe that Jesus resurrected after being dead, we're going to believe the same thing about believers, because that is the promise. He's the first fruits of those who sleep. If he rose from death, so will those who die. So in other words, we shouldn't grieve as though those who have died have lost out. No, they're going to rise from the dead. Now, it may seem odd that Christians would believe that and not kind of understand that, but remember, this Christianity is new. As a matter of fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, there was some denying it altogether, and there's a whole chapter there of Paul talking about it. So, in the first century, when Christianity was being spread, you had some who weren't quite fully educated on the resurrection, at least certain details. But anyway, so he says, those that have died in Christ, have fallen asleep in Christ, he will bring with him. But what is he talking about? He says, for this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep in, or those who have fallen asleep, it says. In other words, when Christ returns, we who are alive, whoever they are, they will not precede those who have died. In other words, the King James says prevent, which is it doesn't have the same meaning as it does today, but it means to proceed in the King James, and that's what is translated here. We who are alive at the Lord's return will not precede those who have already died. What is he talking about? He says, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Okay, so when he says that we who are alive will not precede them, he's talking about rising to meet the Lord, as he's going to go on to say. He says, then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord. Okay, so when he says in verse 15 that we who are alive when the Lord returns will not precede them, he means to rise and meet the Lord in the air. And so in other words, as he says in verse 16, the dead are actually going to rise first. So he started out by saying, do not grieve as though Christians who have died are left without hope. In other words, evidently some believed that to die before the return of Christ was to, you've missed out. Paul's saying, no, those that have died are actually going to be the first to rise when he comes. And anybody left, well, we're going to meet them all, but we, of course, are going to rise and meet the Lord after those who have died will rise and meet the Lord. So, and he says, then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. So it is not as though those who have died, we're going to grieve because we're not going to see them, we're not going to meet them, they've missed out. Paul's saying that's not going to be the case. In fact, the dead are going to rise first. So, now here's the thing. First of all, the text does not speak of a secret rapture, because it even says, verse 16, he will descend from heaven with a shout, the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of God. It doesn't sound like a secret. And of course, when you bring in other teachings of the New Testament, you see that the dispensational flavor of the rapture simply is not true. So, but what do people mean when they talk about the rapture? Well, at least we could say this, that there is a difference in what is going to happen to the living when Christ returns than what will happen with the dead. The dead will have a resurrection, but obviously the living are not going to be resurrected, because resurrection is when the dead come back alive. So what is going to happen to the living? Well, we also are going to be changed. Our bodies are going to be changed, and we're going to rise as well. But you wouldn't call it a resurrection. Well, what it says in the text is, in verse 17, it says, we who are alive and remain will be caught up together. Now, that word caught up is what people refer to when they say rapture. And so, in some cases, when people are asking about a rapture, they simply mean the living being caught up at the return of Christ. Now, and in that sense, in that basic sense, well, I have no problem calling that a rapture. Now, I'm careful not to affirm the rapture, of course, because I could just mislead somebody, and they may think of the dispensational type rapture. And so I'm usually careful to explain what I mean. But technically, I don't have a problem calling that a rapture. You can call it something, a catching up. Well, that's the word in the Greek, and so, which is what rapture is supposed to mean. And so, if that's the only concept that people mean when they say rapture, well, certainly it's not a resurrection. It is a rapturing of sort. It's a catching up. And so, I'm just simply saying, I'm not going to walk around saying, yeah, the Bible teaches a rapture, because people could be confused on what I mean, and probably will. But I think I'm going to be more careful to simply not just say the Bible doesn't teach a rapture, because, well, a person may be simply asking about the catching up of the living, or the living being caught up or raptured at the return of Christ, which that concept is truly there. Now, here's the problem, though. The dispensational type is certainly not biblical. This is not an invisible return of Christ. This is together with the resurrection of the righteous, which will not be disagreed with by many. But there isn't a second coming. There won't be a second resurrection of like the wicked later on. So there's not going to be a second stage. The Bible clearly teaches there is a general resurrection. When Christ returns, that's the end. It refers to it as the last day. I think it's John 12. He talks about his word will judge people on the last day. John 6, he talks about raising his people on the last day. Well, we know they rise when he returns, and when he returns is the last day. There's only going to be one resurrection. In John chapter 5, Jesus says, an hour is coming, singular, in which, in that single time period, all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come. Those that have done good, to the resurrection of life. Those that have done evil deeds, to the resurrection of judgment. So both in the same time period. In Acts 24:15, I believe it is, somewhere around there, Paul says the same thing. He says he believes, just like the Jews teach, that there will be a resurrection. That's a single resurrection of both the just and the unjust. There's not going to be two resurrections. Now, of course, Revelation 20 does teach a first resurrection, but in context, it is not a first and second physical resurrection. It is the resurrection contextually, which is symbolic, because John says he sees the souls of those who were beheaded. He doesn't see the bodies. He doesn't just simply say, I saw those who were beheaded, having risen from the dead. He says, I saw the souls of those who were beheaded. And he says they reign with Christ 1,000 years. Well, the New Testament teaches Christ is reigning now. It says that in Acts 2. It talks about him being given all authority. Well, I mean, how much authority do you need? He's already got it all. But there are many places in the New Testament where it teaches Christ is reigning now. I'm not trying to get into all that right now. He's already on the throne. The kingdom is already here in its first stage, which is the stage of conquest and going forward and spreading. When he returns, it's the final stage of the kingdom, which is final triumph, in which all of his enemies are defeated finally. So, but the point is, the kingdom is here. He is on the throne, but the throne is in heaven. It says that in Acts 2, at the right hand of God. He sits on it now, and the souls of those who are martyred go to be with Christ, reigning with him, sharing in his reign. That's what it is, the context in Revelation 20. That's the first resurrection. The second one is going to be the physical resurrection of all, and that's what is happening at the great white throne at the end of the chapter. But anyway, and you know, when in 2 Peter chapter 3, when Peter talks about the return of Christ, he said, all these things will be dissolved, all things will be burnt up, and then will be a new heaven and a new earth. Yeah, that's the coming of Christ. He doesn't say there's going to be a kingdom set up at that point. It's a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness, because that's the end of the plan of redemption. But nevertheless, my point is to say really this. A lot of people that agree with me on these topics will usually just say the Bible doesn't teach a rapture. And of course I know what they mean and will agree, but a lot of people don't understand there's even a difference. Because a lot of people, when they hear me say that, what do you mean it doesn't teach it? It teaches it right there in 1 Thessalonians 4. Yeah, there is you can call the living Christians at the return of Christ being caught up a rapture. But just remember that people may be confused by a flat-out denial of it. It's always the concept of what is meant. And so we always have to keep our terminology in mind. And so, anyway, so in that sense, the Bible teaches what could be called the rapture. But for the most, in my experience, the most common idea is the dispensational one. At least what I run into. The Bible certainly doesn't teach that. Anyway, just a few suggestions on vocabulary and how we communicate. And so, thank you for watching.